All right, this week we're going to talk about line, mass, and form, but it all comes down to your matrix still. I mean, that's the one thing that we need to kind of work with and begin from. So in this image, you're going to see the image on the left is a matrix that's based on light versus shadow, and then on the right, it's going to be an image based on light versus dark. So the light versus dark on the right-hand side, everything has a local value, and that's how you see the differences between areas, whereas down the left, it's going to be between the light and shadow shapes. Below that, you're going to see the notan, which is light versus dark, and that's the pattern in here. Okay? And then next to that, you're going to see the effect of light versus shadow and how that would break down. And then in this image, you're going to see the combination of the two. So what we see in reality is really a combination of the two. We don't really see one without the other. The way that we design our matrix, it can be anything from something that's monotony to discord or chaotic. And harmony is going to land somewhere in the middle. Okay, in this case, the monotony is just a checkerboard. Everything's even and a pattern. And then harmony is variations on a theme. And if you think of variations on a theme, then you can think of it in the way of major and minor key as well. Here we're going to have a dominant factor of it's going to be more light than dark or dark than light. So that's your major key. Or if it's in terms of shapes, our major key is longer, narrower shapes. Some of them are tapered to points. Some of them have little offshoots and so on. But there's a range and a relationship between those. Discord is going to give you a variety and a total breakup and just kind of be chaotic. So harmony is going to land in the middle between monotony and discord. But our primaries of design really have to do more with the marks that we put down on the paper. And visual components are really based or have characteristics of their own, whereas our primaries also have certain characteristics, but those are really more about how you bias the marks you put down on your paper to describe those components. Okay? So, in the beginning, before there was written languages, we use images to comment on the world. I mean, this has to do with caves or cave paintings and so on. And as our verbal communication emerged and tribes and civilizations came around, we ended up with these different unique languages. And in 96, the ethnologies recognized 6,703 living languages spoken throughout the world, but relatively few people understand more than a few of them. But the one thing that we can look at is art and music and dance, and it was pointed out food, all have languages of their own, and those are the languages that we can all kind of cross over and understand. We don't need a written language necessarily to formalize those. We do have relationships in dance, we do have relationships in music, and we have relationships in art. And in art, they're based on our visual components and our primaries of design. The way we measure them is major and minor key, which would be equate to a variation on a theme. And so we'll take a look at some of those now. If you take a look at this is the drawings on the left column are line dominant, and line and texture tend to work the same. They both call attention to the surface. They sit on the surface. Okay, and in these drawings on the left, well, let's look at them across the top. In the drawings across the top, you're going to see there's just line drawing on the top left. The middle top is just mass or flatly lit or notan, and the one on the right is chiaroscuro. It's strongly lit, and we get the dominance between light versus shadow as a major contrast. Our second row, we have the same thing, different images, but we have similar thing on the portrait of the boy on the left. The line and line weight doesn't have anything to do with a light direction. It's just variations on that line, which would sit on the surface. Charles Hawthorne's, this is Robert Henry's painting of this boy is real notan dominant. Okay, it's really about its local values. And then the one on the right, the figure of the woman, that's 4 values and just depicting light direction. It's all about light direction that defines it. Okay, so the line quality of this image neither represents form nor mass. It fully exists as an independent expression. Text can have the same effect or reside in the same category as line as an expressive interruption of the surface or surface of objects within the image without the intent to represent mass or form. It can just be about line. Okay, a lot of the books and things that we read are really about form, and very few talk about line as a design tool, or mass or notan as a design tool, and that's just too bad. It's really disappointing that that's the case, but it is the case, and because all 3 of these components have a really important role in your image making. So I find that by splitting these things apart, you can actually break things down in a really far more interesting ways. Okay? So techniques and rules apply to applications of mediums, not universal truths. So what that means is techniques and rules for techniques aren't rules necessarily. When we deal with our primaries, we want to look at universal truths, things that have relationships, build relationships, but they aren't absolute to one technique or another. Okay? Because, as an artist, you're going to bias those line, mass, or form, and the way you bias those is going to define the style you're creating. So it will define what you can do. So you're going to create your own rules. So a lot of times, when we first start out, people say, well, you have to learn the rules and then you can break the rules. I think that's baloney. It's just a bunch of garbage, because really what it is that's just saying, copy these rules, draw like me, and once you draw like me, then you're going to want to draw like yourself. And then go figure it out, and it's up to you. But there's nobody that really supplants other information. You got to go figure it out. And what is that you're trying to figure out? Well, it's not that difficult when you look at things in terms of your application of line, mass, and form, and how you bias those visual components. It's up to you. And if you build clarity, and that's what we're going to do today, is look at clarity. And once you build the clarity, then you're going to be able to go do anything you want. In this image, this is an Andrew Wyeth image, and you can see that form is a dominant factor here because the tonal contrast is really great between light versus shadow. Secondary is texture. Look at the strong amount of texture in the wall, in the cow, in the stonework, even in the mountain in the background. There's a diminished contrast, smaller texture, but still it exists as a texture. So it'd be form and texture. There's some areas in the house that the local values or notan feels a little more dominant, but the fact that because there's such a strong dark tree and some elements on the roof and the windows. Now this image, this photograph, is mostly form dominant, but you can see the darkening, her dark hair blends into the shadow shapes. So there's a merging of those two, both form and notan. Okay? And then the texture from the background, the texture coming on each side of her face there. Those textures create patterns and work like line. So we have line, mass, and form, all three in this one image. But they're designated to different areas. Okay, so we don't confuse them. It's not unclear. And that's what we want to do today, is design and be clear about it. This image is line, but predominantly form and line. He's not masking the line. He's very, very open about making the line very a contributing factor to the drawing. Yet those lines are depicting light versus shadow. So if the purpose of the line is to depict light versus shadow, it's going to look something like this. Same thing here. Okay? It's lines that are depicting light versus shadow. That's because that's the dominant feature here. In this image, what I did is I just transitioned from chiaroscuro to Notan. So you see the two across the top, and then down below, the one on the lower left, Notan dominant, and the one on the lower right is chiaroscuro dominant. The one in the middle, I just merged them through opacity, on a computer. Okay? And when you combine them, you're going to see that, any image you make is going to be the relationship between those. It could be somewhere in the middle. Or it could be designed with one thing in mind in one area and another in another area. And then it's going to feel a little bit more designed. Here's another example of the same thing, where what I did was I just superimposed one over the other and changed the opacity to kind of merge them. And you can see the variance there. This was strictly form. So it's just indicating where the light and shadow patterns work. Again, strictly form. Again, same thing. And again, the same thing. But we can identify, when we're dealing with form, you can identify a lot of information in a simple way. This being 4 values, the dark of her hair, and then the light, shadow, and then reflected light. And just with those 3 or 4 values, we get the implication of form. But you can also get a little more light information just by the contrast and intensity of or the contrast here of the light and the fall off of the light. If you notice on her rib cage to her hip, it's the lightest, and so we get the feeling that there's a strong light coming from her side, and those are the planes that are most perpendicular to the light source. And then as the light falls down her leg, it gets darker. So our light gets darker and our dark gets lighter. We get a little bit of reflected light on the inside of her other calf. So that merging reduces the intensity of light as it falls off. Now, so your light direction is really important, and the shapes that it creates. So if you're dealing with drawing form, then you want to be really careful about the shapes that you create with light versus shadow. Okay, and looking at these 3, each of these 3 drawings, I just moved the light around. The model was in the same pose. I just moved the light around in order to get a different response. So depending on what you want to depict, what you choose to depict, is really going to be about where you place your light. This is a case where I was just looking at the range of tonal contrast in a focal area. But that change of tonal contrast could equate to either form or mass or line put in a designated area that would work the same. Another Wyeth painting, highly chiaroscuro, the strong light and shadow on the door, on the on the back of Christina, and then her dress is a dark dress, and it doesn't seem to have as high contrast as everything else in light and shadow. So it kind of merges in with the shadow. And then outside, the tree outside has very little information about being in light or shadow. It's pretty much Notan. It appears very, very flat. Here's a really nice painting too, where the shadow shapes, or the darker shapes of the shadows, and the dark of her hair and earring all merge together. And when they all merge together, they create this simple silhouette that brings more attention to the areas in light. In this image, there's an area of smaller contrasting marks in the area of his face. They aren't the darkest marks in the image, but it is the area that's framed clearly by his hat and his collar, and it has the greatest amount of small marks. This is created based on patterns as well, tonal contrast and patterns and texture. So we have local values, and then we have texture in different areas that create passages and move your eye through this image. This image is really more about Notan, except for in areas around her face, his face, and then along her back, where we see a shadow shape in there. Other than that, it's pretty much just Notan. Same here in this image. It's predominantly Notan, except for some of the effect of light on the table behind the girl and out the window and on the rim and top of her face. So he changes up the mode in a certain zone, which creates focus. Same thing here. This is a situation where it's mostly Notan, but the patterns in different areas kind of designate where you're going to look first, and all the textures and stuff on the ground and the table, the pants. Her dress is very unique, and then behind the other soldier, underneath the boat, is like a checkered blanket, and so you get these patterns in there within the textures that are pretty dominant. Along in her face is the only area where you get a sense of chiaroscuro, and that sets her apart. Here we have an image on the left of mass and line dominant, and then on the right is mass and texture dominant. Now you see form in the American Gothic image from Grant Wood, but at the same time, the greater contrast is within the texture. If you notice the textures in his face, on the wall of the building behind, the curtain in the window behind, and the woman's apron, that's where, and the man's overalls, is where you're going to see the stronger contrast of texture within there. There is a sense of form in there, but it's kind of played down. This image by Nikolai Fechin is really texture dominant. Okay? Or it's mass dominant with texture. It's got a texture overall, but it's predominantly mass. There is form in it, but it only appears in certain little areas. But it's mostly mass and texture. And this image too is quite a bit of texture, and then just simple mass. There is a little bit of form on the back of her arm and the back of her dress, but that's pretty much it. But heavy texture. This is what I want to do today. We're going to be drawing from the model, but I want you to be conscious of the marks you put down and designate the types of bias that you're going to put in different areas. Okay? There's an example of creating a bias in an image too, and out of 4 values, from his shirt to the background to his skin to his coat, there's 4 distinct values, and then within each value group there's a different range of contrast. So it allows you to design and create focus, and then start breaking one area down, then the next area, then the next area. And since there's a strong contrast between all 4 areas, it gives you latitude to increase the tonal contrast in any of the given areas and still have them hold together. If there wasn't the strong distinctive values between these groups and I put the contrast within each zone, this thing would fall apart, just fall apart. Sargent did the same thing with this image. It's another one. Now this is based on a Notan, and between the light of his face, his sweater, and then the background in his face has more contrast. His shirt or his sweater has the second amount of contrast, and the background has very little contrast other than the brush strokes on the outside. But, if it was painted all out, it would be, pretty simple background. So pay attention to this one and take a look at the way that he handled the line work. He made it very different on her face than he did on her hair, than he did on her blouse. And that's what I want to do today. I want to really exaggerate the differences. This is Robert Fawcett. Now, when we look at this image, you're going to see that he handles the different areas of this design in a different way. Okay? The pink is line, but it's form. It's also depicting form. The line is depicting form. And the blue areas is depicting the texture. And in the yellow area down there is pretty much mass. Okay? It's so tight of texture, it almost feels like a mass. You can see similar things happening in this image where there's different textures in the different zones. And feel free to draw these too. I put these on here that you guys can draw them and try to break them down. This image is line and form. There's not hiding the line. There's cross contours and cross hatching, and it's all the marks are depicting light and shadow. There's not a lot of form in this image. On the pillow behind or the cushion behind him, and then the dog, there's a good amount. But other than that, it's predominantly mass dominant. And you can see the texture in his coat too. So these broad brush strokes are kept within the coat, which helps to designate the type of design that it is. In this image, you can see the difference between the marks that they laid down for the skirt as the hair. They're very different. Even though they're both near the same value, their appearance is very different. This is a great image as well. And this image is set up mostly as Notan, and then there's form on her face, which sets it apart, brings focus to her face. There's a strong harmony between the types of lines in this image, from these slow curves to the around her collar to more relaxed curves on the folds on her shirt and her upper part of her hair, and then her hands are these longer bits of straight within the curves, and then real curved shapes along the silhouette of the folds on her shirt and her hair as it curls under. And clearly this is a case where the artist was more interested in playing with the range of shapes rather than depicting the form. Here he's expressing different ideas. The top one is form. The one down below here, this is really about passages and creating edges. This one's really about, it's a little bit of form and then a lot of textures. And this one is a little bit more form and a lot more textures. This painting, you see a lot of brush strokes around the outside and some on her dress. You see a little fewer on her face. but her face is the only area that has a lot of form contrast. There's a little bit on her arms and a little less on her wrap and dress. This one appears to be mass dominant, except the trees, the birch trees and the other tree going up into the light, they flip from being dark over light to light over dark. And the little bits of light in the distance too separate slightly too. So, this is it's an interesting piece, but you can see it's in the foreground, it's all pretty much mass dominant because it appears in the shadow. And then it has these effects of form in them as well. This one, pretty much form and texture. Line and mass. And I put these pages on for you to look at and kind of peruse. These were from different artists. This is a famous artist course, some pages from the famous artist course. And it's interesting. These are different illustrators describing some of the things that they do, and it falls in line with designing these things based on line, mass, and form. Like this little image here is on mass. The one on the right is mass and line or texture. Okay. The other drawing with the women and the woman and the little girl getting on looks like a train. As that's in that image, it's pretty much line. Now, there are lines that go across the forms, but they aren't all consistently depicting a light side and a shadow side. So they're not really crafting form itself. They're just wrapping over existing forms. But the lines themselves aren't indicating a light and shadow. And that's what we would look at. As far as chiaroscuro, we're going to look at the light and shadow and not necessarily the cross contours that describe a form. I thought these were good to put in here too. This is just the history of an illustration and where it begins and where it ends. Values and tonal groups, setting up the design that way. Mood and composition. Okay, these characters on the top, really high contrast of light versus shadow. This is from famous artist course. And the one on the left here, the Albert Dorn drawing of this woman, you can see that the design patterns or the way that he uses his lines vary from her skirt to her purse to her coat to her hat to her face. So he's changing the way that he makes his marks. And that's something that you can work with as well, which is kind of fun. Now, when the lines, the thick and thinness of lines isn't too consistent to a particular light source, it's going to then call attention to itself as the line. The line drawing on the right, there is some reference to form in the marks in here, but it's pretty much strong lines and line shapes, or line for line's sake, and then some form, secondary. I think we went over this in a prior week, but this was varying textures. And you can see the drawing on the left has a little bit more to do with light versus shadow. And then the one on the right is really more about local values and the patterning of the local values. Same thing here. You can see the image on the left on the bottom, there's clearly a light side and a shadow side to the street, whereas the one on the right, the tonal contrast was rearranged, and so it gives you this kind of a flatter quality. There's a whole lot of form going on in here, but still a variety of textures. Okay, and in this painting, it's very realistic. There's a lot of marks that are really trying to depict the actual things, that the artist sees. So by breaking these components down, you can create a specific style or look based on how you break down these manners of making your marks, and that has to do with or this is how you can create different styles. Here's like 4 different style paintings that have all different modes of design in them. The one on the left is predominant light and shadow. Rembrandt has a little bit of light and shadow and a lot of mass. The Sorolla painting has more mass than a little bit of shadow. And then the Rouault on the end has nothing to do with light, but it's just light dark patterns and line. Here's 3 more. Dan McCaw's drawing painting on the left. That has a little bit more texture overall. The Sorolla painting in the middle that has a great amount of texture, all in the rocks and in the water. And then a more controlled texture by Jeremy Lipking on the right in the skirt. And in this one you can see it's mostly no tan, with a little bit of inclusion of form. And that's it. So I hope that kind of draws a little distinction between the different modes that we can draw in.